Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alan Blue.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So great to see so many people here. I guess we're bringing in some more chairs. So those of you who have no place to sit, sorry about that. We're getting to it. So we are thrilled today to welcome the president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, to come speak to us. I want to remind people that we do these things in order to inspire the people in this room and the people who are watching these feeds with new ideas, new perspectives, and things which are close to the heart of what we do here at LinkedIn. So be thinking about questions you've got and ways in which you think you might want to actually participate in some of the things that are happening, or ways you think our company should. If you want to watch us on the stream, or you want to catch up on old speaker series, things that happened in the past, you can always go to speakers.linkedin.com and check it out there. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the president of the World Bank, Jim Kim. All right. So we have a tradition here at LinkedIn. So all new employees, not all, we have too many new employees now, but many new employees will be invited up on stage during their first couple of weeks to introduce themselves to the company. And they do that in part by talking about things that are not on their LinkedIn profile. Uh-huh. And we always warn them ahead of time, so they're ready to talk about it. And we've warned you, so tell us what is not on your LinkedIn profile.
I thought that, are you going to show some pictures or something? Is that the case?
I believe we are.
Yeah, Okay.
All right.
So I played football at Muscatine High School, and I was a quarterback on the football team. And people are usually impressed by that because, especially when I was president of Dartmouth College, huge football tradition there. But I always tell them, but the second part of the story is what's most important. Muscatine High School had the longest losing streak in the nation. And then that was my senior year in high school. And I just want you all to know that we maintained the perfect record of no wins and 56 losses over about a 6 or 7 year period. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes. But it wasn't just football, right?
It wasn't just football, and I also played basketball. And
we have a picture of basketball?
Yeah.
Oh, we do.
So we were better at basketball. And when I was in junior high, I had aspirations that I would play basketball, probably not professionally, but I thought I'd play in college. And I was actually recruited by one very small college in Iowa to play basketball. But it ended, and I broke too many bones and too slow to play anymore. So the only sport I play that I can do a little bit competitively is golf. So I still play golf. I recently did an interview with David Rubenstein. He does the peer-to-peer on Bloomberg, and he asked. I think I'm one of the relatively few people who played golf with both President Obama and President Trump. So that's something that's not on my LinkedIn profile.
It is, however, on your Wikipedia page. So,
is it? Yeah, probably.
And actually, and your handicap is also on.
Yes, yeah. Well, they asked me, and David is always, he asks the most impertinent questions, and he said, so who's the better golfer, right, of the two? So my answer was that President Obama, in the 6 years I've been playing with him, has improved more than any golfer I've ever seen, right? But he went from about a 20 handicap to a 10 handicap, which is just tremendous. President Trump has been playing his whole life, and he's an extremely good golfer. I mean, he's really, really good. So I said there are two different kinds of golfers. One that started late in life and is improving, and the other who has been an accomplished golfer for a long time. And I looked at David and said, how's that? So I've been in Washington long enough now that those answers you have to kind of practice in your head.
Exactly.
Over time.
Yeah. Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. So one of Jeff Wiener's our CEO, one of his favorite books he talks about all the time is Mountains Beyond Mountains. And I thought it might be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about your experience with Partners in Health. You were founder of that organization, and it really is a tremendous story. So if you could just spend a few minutes talking about that history.
Sure. My background was that I grew up in Iowa. My father was a dentist. My mother is a philosopher, and my father passed away, but my mother continues to do her work in Confucian philosophy. She studies. She her grandfather was among the first Christians in Korea. This was now more than 100 years ago, and but she ended up doing her dissertation on Confucianism at the University of Iowa, of all places. And so I had an extremely practical father. Dentists are among the most practical human beings on earth, and a philosopher mother. And so one day I was just home from Brown, and my father picked me up, and we were still living in Iowa, and we were driving home from the airport, and he turned around and said, Jim, what do you want to study? And so I said, Dad, I think I really want to study political science and philosophy and go into politics, right? And this is a true story. He literally pulled the car over to the side of the road, and he looked at me and he said, when you finish your residency, you can study anything you want, right? So I had that part of me, and so I was involved in the Third World Center at Brown. I was doing so many political things, but I was also doing my pre-med because it's a very strong influence. When I tell this story to an audience like this, people laugh, right? But I told this story once to a group of first generation Korean Americans. Nobody laughed, right? And they just shook their heads. Of course, that's what you'd say, right? But anyway, I then got into medical school and then immediately got into a PhD program. And there I met Paul Farmer, and some of you may know him, one of the most remarkable human beings alive today. And he and I were both studying medicine and anthropology. So after I got into medical school, my father gave me permission to study other things. And so I did a PhD in anthropology. And we began asking ourselves, and so Paul used to call it, with our ridiculously elaborate educations, what's the nature of our responsibility to the world? And so we decided that we were going to start an organization and we were going to work in the very poorest areas and then continue to insist that even the poorest people deserve to have the best healthcare, the best education, the best housing. And we weren't building skyscrapers, but we were saying everyone deserves decent healthcare, decent education. And in healthcare, because that was our area, we wanted to go as far as we possibly could. And so we ended up running into these incredibly complicated problems that the rest of the world were saying, they're too complicated to tackle among poor populations. Drug-resistant tuberculosis was the first that we ran into. And then we launched this huge effort to convince the world that they should treat it. And we won that fight. The next, which was even bigger, was HIV. I mean, young people here probably can't imagine it, but in the early 2000s, we had treatment that turned AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable chronic disease. And literally 99.99% of the physicians who were in the HIV world were saying it's too complicated to treat in Africa. But there were 25 million people who were living with HIV in Africa, so we were essentially sentencing 25 million people to death. And they'll tell you different stories now, but I can tell you that back then, 99.99%, there were literally a handful of us who were saying, no, what I kept saying is, this is our moment to define our whole generation. If we let 25 million people die because we think it's inconvenient or complicated to treat them, we will always be remembered as the generation that let 25 million people die. And so Paul and I were among the first to really push for HIV treatment, and we won that battle too, right? And so Partners in Health continues to build fantastic programs in the most difficult places. In Liberia, in the middle of the Ebola outbreak, they were building systems and building programs. And what we've always done there, it's in many ways we hope a sort of kindred spirit of what you guys do. We're constantly trying to push the boundary of what people think is possible. And so that's what Partners in Health does. And then I've just been taking the same idea into different realms. Now at the World Bank Group, I feel like my mission hasn't changed at all from the work we did at Partners in Health. What we talked about at Partners in Health was something we called making a preferential option for the poor, meaning that it's not that we value anyone's life less than others, but we believe that we should value the lives of the poorest a little bit more, just because they're faced with so many obstacles. And so, I had the great opportunity to meet with so many different people, including Pope Francis. And I said to him, our mission, and I speak Spanish, I said, our mission is to make a preferential option for the poor. And it comes from literally every religious tradition in the world has that basic idea. And so it's what we're now doing at the World Bank Group. We're asking a very straightforward question. What can we do to make the global system work for everyone, especially the poorest? And for us, it's also the planet. We have to focus on climate change and on environmental sustainability, because wherever you go in Africa, there's not a single African leader I've met who hasn't told me. Everyone says to me, the boot of climate change is on our necks, and we did almost nothing to put the carbon in the air. Our carbon footprint has been almost zero, and yet the boot of climate change is on our neck more than anyone else's. And so the Partners in Health work was great because we had a chance to tackle problems that everyone told us was impossible, right? And I think you guys are tackling impossible problems. You know why I know that? Because I have 2 million followers on LinkedIn, right? Now, you ask my kids, they can't believe, that's the only cool thing about me from my kids' perspective, is that I have 2 million followers. So you guys do the impossible too.
Do you think there's a connection between the background you brought to the problem and your willingness to bite off something which seemed impossible? Because one of the things we focus on here in the Valley when we think about innovation is about defining a problem well, and then putting people from different backgrounds trying to solve that problem. The people with different backgrounds are going to produce the most innovative and interesting solutions. So that anthropology background, or maybe even philosophy background.
Well, I guess when people ask me for career advice, right, the one thing, I think back and think, what's been sort of the common theme throughout my life? And it's been that I have said yes to proposals that either were thought to be impossible or said yes to jobs that people later, soon after I accepted them, would say that I'm completely unqualified for. And I think that think about it. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is in San Francisco. If you see a case of that in San Francisco General Hospital, everyone's going to be running around saying, "Oh my God, this is so difficult, so complicated." We treated it in the slums of Lima, Peru. We treated it in rural Haiti, and we had better outcomes. I mean, to this day, our programs have better outcomes than San Francisco General Hospital. And it's just the way we do it is just very different from the way others do it. But when you've had that experience, the first time people say impossible to treat, impossible to do, impossible to change policy, and then you do it, you get a different kind of sense of what to take on next. HIV treatment, I mean, we're talking 25 million people in Africa, and everybody, and Bill Gates will admit it, even Bill Gates was saying it's impossible to do, forget about it. And Bill Gates is one of my absolute heroes. He's taken on so many difficult problems, but as somebody as generous and forward-looking as Bill just said, I just don't see how we're going to do it. It's impossible. So that was the second experience. And so now I think my own team, my World Bank team, some of them are here, they couldn't believe the stuff that I took on at first. In terms of organizational change, we took on huge tasks. But now, we just received a capital increase that nobody thought we'd get. And again, up until 2-3 weeks before we put the capital increase on the table, my own team was telling me it's impossible, right? And I think there's just something that over all these years, there are times when things are impossible, and there are times when you're wasting your time. But I have been able to see through fog a little bit better, but it's only because I've had that experience. And so what I would say is, and what I'm not telling you about is all the times we failed. There's so many things that we tried that didn't work out, right? And so it's only by doing that that you get the sort of, the gut feeling ability to be able to say, this is really worthwhile. I think that if I were to say that what I do is biased in any way, it's biased in the direction that when people say that something is impossible to do for poor people, I really, really resist that, right? Because it's so easy. It's so easy to accept it because poor people are not powerful enough to force you to say no, right? And so
you're the first president of the World Bank who comes from a background which is not in finance or economics. In
finance or politics. They've either been politicians or bankers.
Got it. So we talk a lot about transformation of our company here, in addition to our own, ourselves and the world. How do you go about transforming a company which has 15,000 employees? In other words, a big company, take on some of those very tough things which that company thinks may be impossible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is, I came into the World Bank with great humility, and I didn't assume that I knew what the bank needed. So I brought in great people. I mean, my friends Mark and Bonita are here, and Mark Thompson is a leadership coach as well as being a very successful entrepreneur. Mark's colleague and close friend Marshall Goldsmith is my leadership coach. So I've had a leadership coach for off and on for about 25 years, but Marshall's been my coach for 10 years. And Marshall has the most incredible network. And so Alan Mulally, the CEO, former CEO of Ford at the time, he was actually the CEO of Ford at the time. He came and he spent 2 days with me at the bank. And I don't know of a more inspiring leader than Alan. I've seen him in Ford. He knows everybody's name. He's always up. He's always positive. He transformed Ford when people didn't think he could. And so Alan came, and Alan said, well, Jim, it's an incredible organization. It's incredibly complicated. But here are the things that I see and he's so polite, that I don't see in a lot of other organizations, right? And so when Alan tells you that these are things you need to look at, we then also brought in consultants, and there was clearly a massive change that was needed in order to move the organization forward. And so I went into the board and I said, okay, I've talked to some of the most brilliant managers and leaders in the world, and it's pretty clear that these are the things that need to be done. And so I laid it out. And the board said, oh, great, we know this, we've seen this, yes, go ahead and change it. I said, but I need to warn you, this is gonna be very loud and very noisy, and people are gonna come to you and say, stop it. I just want you to know now, put your seatbelts on, this is what's gonna happen. They say, oh yeah, but we're with you. And of course, it got very noisy right away, and people would go directly to the board and say, this guy's crazy. And then the board members start saying, gee, Jim, maybe you wanna slow down. But I felt like unless we do this, we cannot really become the organization for the future that we need to become. And the great news is that during the discussions about whether or not we're going to get this increased capital that now is going to take us to more than double the size when I started, they asked about every single one of the changes we made, because they were looking for reasons to not give us the capital increase. Well, have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? And each one of those things we could say, yeah, we did. It was not easy, but we did every single one of those things. And you could imagine that they would say that because Alan Mulally asked the same questions, right? One of the greatest leaders, in the world, when he asks you those questions, and no matter how polite he is, I took him seriously. I took Fred Hassan, another one of the greatest CEOs, most successful CEOs in the US. I took what they told me very seriously. I took what Marshall, what Mark, what others said to me. I took it seriously, and I just felt like, okay, I am going to take this sort of, with knives in my back. And my own team was skeptical, so I told them, don't worry, I'll take all the blame, I'll take all the heat. And then now that we've gone through it, I think everyone is rethinking where they were, and now lots of people are saying, Jim, we were always with you. That's great. I mean,
it's funny the way that worked out.
It's good. That's a good moment. Yeah. I'll take it. Yeah.
So just give, if you could, just like a really quick sketch of the World Bank and what it does, because I'm sure there are people who are listening to us who don't know.
Yeah. So the World Bank was founded in 1944, before the end of World War II. And originally there were two organizations. One, the International Monetary Fund, that was really formed to prevent currency, the currency fluctuations that we saw. There was a lot of beggar thy neighbor policies where people would manipulate their currency. And so the gold standard and the IMF came out. And we came out, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to rebuild Europe. But then the Marshall Plan came along. And if anybody wants to study the Marshall Plan, it's quite amazing. Because we talk about 0.7% of gross national income for aid. That Marshall Plan was 2.7% of US GDP. It was a huge program. And so they took that over, and then we moved and started focusing on poverty and economic development. So 75 years we've been in business, and now our goal is very clear: end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. But we're also now by far the largest funders of climate change mitigation and adaptation in the developing world. We're at about 25 billion, and we're going to keep going up.
Can you say a little bit about what the theory of change, if you will, is for the World Bank?
So the theory of change, it's a cool idea, because we are 189 member countries, and because we have paid-in capital and support from the 189 member countries, and because we have something called preferred creditor status that everyone has to pay us back first, we have about one of the best AAA ratings in the world. And so we're able to borrow at extremely low levels. For any of the finance people, we're borrowing at LIBOR minus 15 or 20 basis points. And so we pass that low borrowing cost on to our clients. So a middle-income country can get 20 or 30-year maturity loan at 2 to 3%. They would never be able to get that on the market. And so in giving them those loans, we say, okay, we're going to give you this, but we want to do something with you. We want to improve communications. We want to improve your roads. Sometimes we give it right to the budget and help them improve their policies, improve rule of law, improve their ability to stamp out corruption. So it's a bank. It's really a bank, but it's also a place of great innovation. We invented the swap. And we invented political risk insurance. We just invented pandemic insurance. Now, the 75 poorest countries in the world are insured against pandemics. And the pandemic insurance policy actually just went into effect with the last Ebola outbreak in Congo. And rather than wait 8 months that we did, as we did in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, we responded within 2 weeks and stamped it out. Right? So for me as a medical doctor and an anthropologist, for the first couple of years, I did nothing but just intensively study both macroeconomics and finance. And because I was new to it, I kept saying, well, gee, why don't we do that? And why don't we do that? Right. And of course, the first answer was, no, we can't do that. And then I just would say, well, why not? Mm-hmm. And if they couldn't give me an immediate response as to why not, I would push. And so pandemic insurance, I was told 15 times that it can't happen. But I enlisted the CEOs of Swiss Re and Munich Re, whose teams also told them it was impossible, but we did it. And it was mostly because we put teams together that never sit together. And so now we're thinking, hey, maybe we can even invent something like famine insurance. Mm-hmm. Famines are almost always related to responding too late. And if you respond earlier, you can actually stop famines from happening. And so now we're in this wonderful conversation with the reinsurance companies about creating famine insurance. So we're a financial institution that can do swaps, that trades on the market every day. That we're limited partners for lots of funds here in San Francisco. But the point is to end poverty. So we are a group that has enormous financial resources, and our goal is very simple: end poverty, boost shared prosperity.
So one of the things which I know is a big area of focus for the World Bank now is around human capital. So I'm first interested in finding out, when you think about human capital, how do you define it? And how close does it come to companies and to the way that companies think about human capital?
So this is one of the things that I really want to emphasize today. So we're just coming out with two things. Every year we put out something called the World Development Report, and this year it's on the future of work. And then part of that is a whole section on human capital, because I am concerned, and our organization is very concerned, that while I'm here because we think technology has a huge upside, a potential upside for poor people in developing countries. But so many countries are not prepared to compete in the economy of the future. How do we know that? Well, in some countries, you see childhood stunting, and stunting is just very simple. You measure how much children are growing in terms of height. Weight varies over time, but height is something that is pretty permanent. And so when we see children who are 2 standard deviations below their height for age, then we say that those children are stunted. And the scientific evidence is pretty overwhelming now that when you're stunted, you have far fewer neuronal connections. And so these children, we've now followed them independently of anything else. We've followed the children who are stunted in many different countries, and we know that their learning outcomes are much poorer, and their earning is much, much lower. So this is a huge problem in the world. I've been screaming and yelling about it, but not very many people, not very many countries have taken it seriously. You know, quality of education. We now have the best data in the world on quality of education. So we call it learning adjusted years of schooling. So, you know, a year of schooling in Malawi is worth about half a year of schooling in Singapore. And so if you put these things together, we're connecting them directly to productivity and economic growth. So we can tell you how much economic growth you're missing out on because you haven't invested enough in your people. Now, the reason this is going to be controversial is I have really pushed, and we've now decided that we're going to do a ranking. Right? So it's a really interesting phenomenon. Every year, my busiest week is when the Doing Business rankings come out. And when the World Bank puts out a ranking, everybody pays attention. Right? And so I get irate phone calls every year after the Doing Business indicators. And this is from heads of state often, because they're angry at where they're coming out. And what I say is, well, it's a ranking, and we can help you next year. And the countries who've done really well are the ones who've come to us and actually tried to reform with our help, right? So and they're going to be movers this year as well. So I decided we're going to do a human capital ranking. And this is going to be even more sensitive because everyone in society is going to look at this. And what's going to happen is countries are going to find that they're ranked lower than countries that they've always felt superior to. Right? And then that's going to start a conversation in those countries that could be explosive. Right? And we're not trying to create an explosive conversation. We're trying to bring attention to something that heads of state and ministers of finance have historically underinvested in, because the returns to votes is much faster if you build a road or if you provide people with energy. The return is faster. So we're trying to create literally incentives and market forces so people will finally invest in their own people. And you know, the countries that have done the best, South Korea, had nothing. In 1963, when I was a 4-year-old in South Korea, the World Bank refused to give South Korea a loan because they thought it was hopeless, too hopeless. The industrial activity and mineral wealth was all in the north. South Korea was just a rural area. You know, in 10 years before, 15 years before, literacy rate was 23%. And so they declared South Korea a basket case. And South Korea's first loan, finally in 63, was for a road, and their second loan was for education. And they were ridiculed by bank staff for taking a loan for education. But the fact that they've invested in it, China's done the same, Vietnam's done the same, Singapore's done the same. You know, the countries that have invested in health and education before the World Bank thought that they should are the ones who are doing so well economically. And so what we're trying to do is just bring to everyone's attention so that they can't ignore it, that investing in your people in health and education is the most important investment you can make for future economic growth. And they're going to say, oh, yes, we understand, and that's great. But there's no pressure on them to do it. This, we hope, will create some pressure.
So how do you think about the ecosystem which is connected to health and to the economy? Because we know for sure from the work that we do here at LinkedIn that it really does effectively require the famous village to be able to solve some of these problems. Companies, educators, and governments, and individuals, and nonprofits actually all working together get you a solution much further. Yeah. So how do you think about encouraging the development of that kind of an ecosystem?
Well, you know, just to give you an example, we've always felt that healthcare and education could be huge job creators because we're not thinking creatively enough about who does healthcare work. So in all of our work in Partners in Health, the success, the reason we have better outcomes in drug-resistant tuberculosis and HIV than San Francisco General is we use community health workers. And the community health workers visit patients every single day and make sure that they're not only that they're taking their medicines, but they're not depressed, that they don't have other medical problems, that they don't have financial problems, so that they can't take their medicines. And by doing that, we get better outcomes. Now, in country after country all over the world, we think that instead of providing subsidies for fossil fuel, which almost so many countries do, if you remove those and instead hired a whole cadre of community health workers and community education workers, community social workers, you could actually improve your outcomes very quickly, very rapidly, and also create wonderful jobs that may not be their careers, but could be the start of their experience in formal employment, and then from there, move on to other things. So we have a vision for it, and our annual meeting, which is happening in Bali, the Indonesians know that they're not going to come out looking so good on the Human Capital Index. And so they've started a transformational plan to improve, and they've created this phenomenal community health worker program that is going to bring their stunting rate down, I think, very quickly, provide early childhood education, and have an enormously positive impact. And this is just because I think President Jokowi and the Minister of Finance, who used to work with me at the World Bank Group, Sri Mulyani, are visionary, and they know that this is an opportunity for them to move financing in that area. And because the ranking is going to come out very soon, they're not going to have political problems with it, and they're going to, in fact, have political support. So there are so many job-rich ways of improving your human capital. It makes just perfect sense to launch this right now. But they're going to be people calling for my head, I'm sure.
So I do want to invite people in the audience to ask questions. I have one more, but there's a microphone here in the center if people do want to ask. So you should feel free, if you've got one, to head over there. So one of the things that LinkedIn has done recently in the sort of neighborhood of ecosystems is we have a partnership with an organization in India called ILNFS. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, I don't know them well. Yeah.
So they have certainly it's the only time I've ever heard of a very interesting way to turn infrastructure investment into investment in the full stack that is necessary to make the economy go. They decide they're going to build a hospital. Then they decide that in order to make the hospital operate, they need to have the supply chain partners. So they will invest in the supply chain partners to get them to the hospital. And then they will invest in the individuals who will work at the hospital so that basically they have a skilled workforce from the local area. And what this has turned into is ILNFS now operates more than 300 training facilities across India, where they train basically people who have no other avenue, no educational avenue towards achievement. They train them to work in hospitals, to work at hotels, to work in a wide variety of things, electricians and so forth. It was actually a really fascinating way in which one company decided to take responsibility for the whole ecosystem. The reason I bring it up is, and what LinkedIn does is we share our learning opportunities with them. So I'm interested in how the World Bank learns new possibilities for the things they might do. You mentioned earlier that, and certainly we know that Partners in Health inspired the World Health Organization to do things differently. You're moving the World Bank in a different direction now. How do you learn from others?
Well, that's why we're here, right? So my former chief of staff and now vice president of the Middle East and North Africa region, Fareed, is in the back of the room. He brought his whole senior team here for 3 days. And it's two ways. I mean, the thing we found is that when we started working with, and we're so thrilled about our collaboration with you guys, right? So we're going to map out, what the jobs are in the world, where the skills exist, what skills are needed, and I think this is going to be, it's going to have really a revolutionary impact. So we've learned a ton from you guys, and we now are going to lots of different organizations, and we're learning from them, but we're also challenging them. We're saying, look, these technologies could have such a huge impact in the developing world. And it also could be very profitable for you to think about the implications of your technology in the developing world. But what we found was that sitting in Washington and then going from Washington to developing countries, and then we go to other capitals with donors and all that, but we weren't coming here And I made my first trip to Israel, which has an incredible entrepreneurial environment, and I just realized that we're missing a lot. And so we've made understanding disruptive technology, fintech, learning from Silicon Valley. We made this one of the real central foci of what we're going to do going forward. And so now, Fareed is, I think, the third regional vice president to bring his whole team out here. And so we need to have that conversation because we're not seeing things that you guys are seeing. But also, I think what we found is that there's not a single entrepreneur out here that I've met who hasn't told me we really want our technology and our insights to help in developing countries. But if you don't start early enough in thinking about the implications in developing countries, I think you can end up in a place where you're focusing your technology to fill a particular need in a particular supply chain, and you're not really thinking about the way it might be used much more broadly. So we're doing it very systematically by bringing folks out here. And then literally every month we have a tech leader coming to the bank and we do a session and ask them what they're thinking. I've learned a lot from people like Jack Ma of Alibaba. I visited Alibaba in Hangzhou, and I've just learned so much from them. And it strikes me that what they've done in many ways democratizing access to capital, to markets, to marketing, to procurement, that could be what the answer or an answer for developing countries looks like in the future. So we're trying to disrupt ourselves, and that's hard. It's hard to disrupt yourself, but we realize we have to, or we're going to make what I call the telephone pole mistake, right? And I haven't told the story recently, but I used to tell it all the time. About 25 years ago, we had an intense argument at the World Bank about whether we would invest in telephone poles in India, right? Now, that was an intense argument, and we decided not to, thank God, right? But we almost started down the path of telephone poles in India. And the question I keep asking is, are we doing the equivalent of building telephone poles in India now? And essentially, we're burdening countries with white elephant projects that by the time they're done, they're going to be completely obsolete. And the honest answer was, we're not sure, right? So that's why we're here. That's why I'm here today, to learn from all of you. Yeah.
Great. Guy, what's your question?
President Kim, thanks so much for coming here, and Alan, thank you for moderating. I'm LinkedIn's chief economist. In a very distant part of my past, I was actually trained as a development economist, and so I have great fondness for the World Bank and what it does, going back many, many moons. One of the things I remember from my days studying development economics is that a lot of the people that we were studying in emerging countries, when they're talking about having capital for a business, that capital is a chicken or an ox. When when we were talking about human capital, it suggested it's not going to college or having really high quality access to heart surgery. It's about getting a vaccination or getting dewormed, getting basic literacy. And very naively, when I think about LinkedIn's core membership and our data, it's a world away from that. We're talking about professionals, even in emerging countries. A lot of the people that are on their LinkedIn members currently in a place like Malawi or Laos are going to be maybe software engineers or maybe expats. That said, there are places where these two worlds can potentially intersect. And I guess I was interested in your opinion about where you think the biggest, most fertile avenues for collaboration between our two organizations are.
Yeah, so one of the things that has been really striking to me is that most people, the folks down the road at Singularity University had told me that probably by 2025, everyone in the world will have access to broadband, whether it's 5G or whatever it might be by then. But 2025, maybe 2030 at the latest, everyone will have access to broadband. So everyone will have access to a smartphone. They may not own one, but they'll be able to watch one, right? And so we know what happens when you get access to broadband and a smartphone. Your aspirations go up, right? So I wouldn't be so sure that those aspirations are going to be so different for very long, right? And we also, and you'll love this as an economist, our economists have studied what happens when your reference income goes up? That means, if the income to which you compare your own. For centuries, it's been the Joneses, right? The folks next door. But it's not the folks next door anymore. It's the folks you see on your smartphone. And so we now know that if your reference income goes up 10%, your own income has to go up 5% for you to maintain the same level of satisfaction. And as an economist, we know how to measure satisfaction now, right? But if you're a poor person, if your reference income goes up 10%, your income has to go up 20% to maintain the same level of satisfaction. So one of the biggest worries I have is that aspirations are going to explode all over the world, and we are not going to be able to keep up in terms of opportunity, right? And so we have completely changed the World Bank into an organization that focuses less on being a lender and a provider of capital, but instead being a facilitator of capital. So just as an example, instead of giving a loan to a private sector company, we create a loan instrument where we take first loss, and then in taking first loss, we de-risk the senior tranche, and then insurance companies can. And so we've turned 100 million into $1 billion, and that's what we're trying to do, because that's the scale that we're going to need to go to be able to even begin to touch these rising aspirations, right? So for us, being in the middle of the knowledge economy and being able to move knowledge around and being able to understand how you guys are moving knowledge around is critical. And so that's why I think the first step that we're taking is we're going to specific cities with you guys and looking at the nature of the needed skills and of the existing skills in that area. And I just think giving people all over Africa a sense of where the opportunities are, but also giving them a sense of what they might want to study in the future, because that's where the needs are. I think that's revolutionary. And then once we get that going, my hope is that we will find other things to do together, right? I think if we can get this right, this will have a huge impact on the movement of people around Africa. And I'm telling you, both Chancellor Merkel and President Macron talk about this all the time. This is the biggest thing we're doing with both Germany and France, which is what they call the Compact with Africa, because they're very explicit about it. They said, we saw from the Syrian refugee crisis that a relatively small number of migrants almost changed the character of what life in Europe was like. And if we don't invest in Africa, in the Sahel, in Nigeria, Ethiopia, if those countries fall, or if those countries collapse in some way, then life in Europe will change fundamentally, right? And so the good news is that these two are so visionary that they know that the answer is to develop Africa. And so we feel that what we're doing with LinkedIn is a real advance, a real important step in the area of really thinking about what the skill mix is in Africa and what we can do to really provide people more opportunities to use their skills and then to know what skills they need to get. Right? So, what we have found is that when you start a collaboration, you have to be concrete and you have to be very specific, and then from there it can grow. So we're thrilled about this. Yeah.
Thank you again, President Kim, for joining us, and thanks, Alan. My name is Nick DePorter. I'm on the public policy team. Of all the current disruptors that are out there in the workforce, gig economy, autonomous vehicles, what concerns you the most?
Yeah, so the two things that concern me the most are what I just talked to you about, the rise in aspirations and our inability to meet those demands, right? The story I tell is my parents, through just sheer dumb luck, got to the United States in the mid-1950s. And it was just luck that got them there. They met here in the United States, married. My older brother was born in the US, and then they went back, because that was the idea, to go back. But then we moved back here because their aspirations had been raised up by living in New York City, right? So that's happening everywhere in the world now, and it's not happening by having to come. They're seeing it on their smartphones. So I'm really worried about this. The other thing I'm really worried about, frankly, is climate change. Right? I mean, we're looking at this Hurricane Florence, right? And hotter air holds more water, and warmer water makes hurricanes more serious. Right? And again, I see it all over the world, and I think we're not moving fast enough. And so, having been a physician and activist, I had always seen the solution to be more giving by rich countries. But at this point, it's not anywhere near enough, and the speed and power of philanthropy will never meet the demands that I'm talking about in climate change or in aspirations. And so the most important thing is that we've got to move capital to where it can be used most effectively. But if you look at most of the people who are owners of capital or asset allocators, for them, all of Africa is just a single a risk group, and it's all risky, right? So there's so many things we have to do to make the system work for everybody, but those are the two. Everyone's rising aspirations and climate change, and we're way behind on both of them.
I have a question from the stream, so
Great.
from LinkedIn employees that are watching in other locations. As automation takes away more and more jobs, what are your thoughts on the need for more expansive social protection or even universal basic income?
Yeah. So the gig economy, my son just started college a couple weeks ago, and he's basically preparing himself to do a bunch of gigs, right? I mean, that's how his life he thinks is going to be, especially in the early part, and that's fine for him, right? But in Africa, 75% of all working people are in informal employment, right? And they don't have any social protection. So the informality that may lead to dynamism and variety of careers for let's say Ivy League graduates can lead to disaster for people living in Africa, for example. So social protection is really important, and what we're saying in this report on the future of work is that social protection should follow people regardless of their employment status, right? And so many countries, social protection is related to a job, and almost always related to a formal job, right? So we're trying to figure out how countries can provide social protection to everybody, whether they're in informal employment or not. And so this is something we're doing along with the International Labor Organization, and it's an extremely high priority. Now, there are different views of this. And so Jack Ma told me, he said, my grandfather worked 6 days a week, 18 hours a day, and he felt very busy. I work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and I feel very busy. My children are going to work 3 hours a day, 3 days a week, and they'll feel very busy, right? And that's, his vision is that not everyone's going to be working, and there will be enough income around for everyone, and there will be a lot of leisure time activities. Well, I have to tell you, having worked in some of the poorest countries for a very long time, I don't think that's what's going to happen in a lot of poor countries. I think what it's going to mean is dislocation. I think it's going to mean that people will, on the one hand, see what life could be like, and then feel that their lives are pretty hopeless. And I think you're going to see the potential for fragility, conflict, violence, all those things that we already see in so many places. So social protection is a critical part of it. But the other part, human capital, they're not going to feel hopeful unless they have had the kind of healthcare and education that makes them feel that they can compete. Our sense is that if people feel like they've had the kind of healthcare and education and they feel that they actually can compete, it's different from feeling like just because of the accident of their birth that they've been dealt a hand that literally is excluding them from the global economy. That's when you're going to have the biggest problems with unrest, I think. Yeah.
My name is Shadi. I'm from the Economic Graph team. We work very closely with the World Bank research.
Yes, thank you for your work. I'm looking at some of the things that you guys are finding. It's just so fascinating, right? Where the Middle East and North, I just looked at a graph today, where the Middle East and North Africa are gaining skilled workers and where they're losing skilled workers too. Very cool stuff. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So as we talk about the future of work, one of the things that come to mind is automation, the impact of automation and AI and workforce displacement. And one of the industries that come to mind is self-driving cars or autonomous cars. And as we think about these industries, there are newer industries that are emerging to disrupt these disruptive industries. So for example, companies like Uber and Airbus are working on autonomous vehicles basically they're called self-piloted passenger aircrafts. So the replacement for short...
I'll let you guys take those first flights before I get on. Yeah.
They're actually testing these right now, and they're supposed to be a short-range urban transport to replace the short-range urban transportation, like cars and trains. So do you think that the rate at which this change is happening is sustainable for the economy, and what can we do to prepare for it?
Well, the thing is, I don't think we have a choice. I mean, my understanding is that this is going to happen whether we like it or not. And so the reason we're here is we're now trying to readjust our attitude to say, look, it's not a matter. I mean, to be honest, 3 or 4 years ago, we were only saying things like, oh, this is going to be terrible in developing countries. And we've completely changed our tune to say, well, it could be terrible in developing countries, but we better get our heads around this to see how this might be helpful. And one of my favorite companies that I talk about all the time, Zipline, right? They're using their drones to first deliver blood in Rwanda. Now they're in many countries and are delivering healthcare products of all different kinds. They've just begun a conversation with Indonesia, a country with tens of thousands of islands, and now are trying to think about completely disrupting the nature of healthcare by not having to develop these supply chains for blood and other medical products, but then using drones. And for them, they had to get into Rwanda early, and they adjusted the way they thought about their technology because of their experience in Rwanda. Now, that's one example, but we'd like to see hundreds of other examples where people really see that they can make a profit, that they can have a huge social impact, and that they can take the best technology and then maybe even learn. I mean, they call it reverse innovation, right? General Electric was famous for having gone into India and had to rethink the way they built ultrasound machines. And they found that the new machines were so useful that they're now in all the hospitals in the United States, right? So that's what we hope we see. But our experience now has been that unless we keep knocking at the door and keep putting problems in front of the most brilliant innovators, they're not going to think necessarily about implications of their technology, say for Central Africa, right? But if we keep doing it, I've found that entrepreneurs out here are really excited about the possibility that their great technology could transform the lives of somebody in Central Africa.
And bring us home.
Hi, Dr. Kim. Thanks for being here. I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on China and Africa and the increase of Chinese developmental finance in Africa. I know that as a historically perceived like Western institution, sometimes the World Bank can run up against critiques about neocolonialism or just different feelings that the West can be very paternalistic in doing development work in Africa, whereas China is seen as more of a South-South partner that's helping a fellow emerging economy. So I was wondering how you perceive them as a player in this space, and any other thoughts there?
Well, the role of China, first of all, there are just some basic facts about China that are really important to know. First of all, they're about a, $15-16 trillion a year economy, just behind the US in terms of being one of the largest economies in the world. But just like Korea and Japan 20, 30 years ago, they have an extremely high savings rate. So the population saves their money. And so in the US, the savings rate as a percentage of GDP is actually negative. People are in debt, right? In China, it's 40% of GDP. So if you have a $15 trillion economy and an additional 40% going into the banks in terms of savings, that's a lot of capital that you have to get a return on over time, right? And so that's just a fact about China, and they continue to grow at 6%, right? So this is, and China is only at 25% of US GDP per capita. And Japan and Korea didn't start slowing down until they reached 75% of US GDP per capita. So there's a lot of room here for China to grow. I know the Chinese leaders. In a bizarre twist of fate, President Xi, when he spent time in the Midwest United States to learn about American agriculture, he actually stayed for 3 weeks in my hometown in Iowa that I grew up, Muscatine, Iowa. Every time I see him, we talk about Muscatine, our friends in Muscatine, Iowa, right? So I know the leaders, And I know that what they want the world to see is that they really want to find what they call win-win solutions, where they get a return on their capital, right? And not necessarily huge returns on their capital, but reasonable returns on their capital, and they provide risk capital, meaning they're actually putting their capital at risk in projects to develop infrastructure in Africa. And there's a lot of critiques. One of the critiques is they need to be more transparent about who they're giving their money to, what the interest rate is, so that we know where these countries stand. And this is something I've talked to them about directly, and they know that they need to do that. They know that that's the direction that they need to go. And if you ask the Africans, I mean, some are critical of what China has done. Others are saying, hey, they're the only ones putting risk capital into infrastructure projects in our countries. And so they, by definition, have an important role to play. So I think that there have been some hiccups along the road. I mean, I think that there are things right now that the President Xi has said he wants to improve. But their commitment to creating win-win situations in Africa is very real. I can tell you it's very real. And so the task is not to critique back and forth, but the task is to say, okay, so you have a $15 trillion economy with a 40% savings rate, and the president wants to invest in infrastructure in Africa. That's positive. That's a good thing. Right? Now, how do we make it work better? How do we make it more transparent? How do we make sure that these projects actually are contributing to job growth in these countries? Well, that's something that we're doing right now, and it's in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there will always be critiques. But I think what the Chinese will point out is that there were countries that engaged in colonialism, and they're not one of them. Right? So you have to say, compared to what? What they're doing now compared to what? They didn't force any country to learn Chinese, right? They didn't force any country to adapt mannerisms and legal structures that look like the colonizing country. And, in quiet moments, over a Mautai, they'll tell me, we were never colonizers, right? So I just think historical reality has to be brought into the picture, and we have to have a fair, evidence-based historical conversation. From my perspective, the fact that they're putting so much risk capital into places that so badly need it is something that we can work with.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Complicated answer, complicated problem.
Absolutely. We are out of time. Thank you so much for coming and talking.
Alan, thank you. Thanks. And let me just say, from all of the World Bank employees, any of you who are working with us, thank you for doing it. It's one of the coolest collaborations we have. Let's keep it going. All right? Thank you. Alan, thank you. Thanks.